Okay, good morning. Hello. Good morning.
Good morning. Hey.
I think we need Catherine to stand up so everyone can go quiet. Awesome.
She's the boss. She's the boss.
Yes. All right. Thank you so much. We have the pleasure this morning to take you through the summary of what we learned yesterday. And I'm sure there's a lot that we learned, but we're going to give you very brief summary of what we learned. And I'm going to do that together with my colleague here, Anna, who is a WHO consultant and also a member of the steering committee.
Okay.
Do you want to introduce me?
Yeah, of course. And here I'm with Francis. He's a member of the planning committee. He's from EthiXPERT in Kenya. So I will start with what we have on the morning, and then Francis is going to go through the afternoon. Okay, so Francis, just let me come here. Sorry, we didn't have time to have slides or whatever, so we're going to do a short summary of the main themes that appeared yesterday. So we started our meeting with Joe's very clear keynotes, where he introduced us to the subject of the meeting and invited us to reflect on how ethics is embedded in research priority settings. Different questions came out there. What is the basis for priority setting decisions? What principles are guiding the process? What criteria are behind these decisions? Most of the time, these principles are there in this exercise, but they should be explicit and they should guide the process in a substantive way. And why? Because ethical decisions are made during these processes and ethical principles should guide them. And also there are these allocation issues, how do we decide on scarce research resources, who should decide on how these resources are allocated, how do we ensure that we make fair decisions and that the process is fair, who benefits from these exercises and what benefits count, and also how do we ensure that those who are affected by these allocation decisions are involved somehow in this decision-making process. And then we could discuss all these things during the morning. We had 7 Pecha presentations and 3 case studies, where we learned about different priority setting cases, some on specific areas, a research agenda for family planning in Uganda, and also national research agendas exercise in Peru and Malawi. And we could see that some common ethical issues in all those cases regarding inclusiveness, how can representation and meaningful stakeholder involvement be ensured, how can communities, end users, patients, vulnerable and marginalized groups, and also people with lived experience be engaged in a meaningful way so that their voices are heard. How do we get insights into stakeholders' values and needs? Also, this meaningful engagement includes clear communication, dialogue, transparency, and accountability to build trust among communities. And this is particularly important to increase the social value of research and to strengthen credibility of the process. Also to support the implementation then of the research that is being funded and conducted in these countries. What else did we learn? The importance of this process being informed by evidence also was raised to identify gaps and possible research questions, and also the methods that are being used during these processes so that we can assess the validity of these research priorities. There were also issues related to time management, the duration and of these exercises and the gaps between these exercises. It was also that we could see in many of these cases, and this also brought to our attention the need to have resources allocated to this exercise, and also other aspects that could affect the continuity of these processes over time. For example, political situations that are always kind of common in low and middle income countries. And just to end, another thing that came out is that most of these processes were considered as technical processes, and ethics was not considered explicitly a part of them. I hope we can discuss a little more about this point today. This is all for me. Francis, over to you.
Thank you very much, Anna. And I will be talking about what we covered in the afternoon. And as the presenter started us off by warning us about the challenges of presenting in the afternoon, I think it would be necessary for us to engage a bit more for the afternoon session in terms of, for each table, I would want you to at least think about one ethical issue that arose from the afternoon sessions. I'll give a summary, but I want you, as I give the summary, to reflect between yourselves, and then I will ask someone to pass the mic and be able to tell us, at least from each table, one ethical issue that you think arose from the presentation that I'm going to give a summary about. So the afternoon session was started off by Toto, one of our planning committee member, and she gave a brief overview of the James Lind Alliance framework. And then Bridget came in to give a summary of the themes of the presentations that were going to be discussed. In Toto's presentation, she gave a brief overview of the history, the principles, and the success stories around the GLA framework. And I think she really emphasized on the fact that this is a grounded approach that includes, collecting views from, lived experiences of, people, and it's quite a flexible approach that can be used either, from whichever angle you want to use it. It involves several workshops, which ultimately result to a very condensed list of, priorities. So you can start from a very broad perspective, but the aim is then to condense that into a very small and manageable list of, priorities. As I said, after that, Bridget came in to introduce the theme, and, she introduced the fact that the speakers were going to talk about how to amplify marginalized voices and the ethical implications of, doing this. And I think one of the things that I picked up, and I'm saying only one, and then we'll invite two contributions from two tables to give us what they, picked from that, from the first presentation. But I think Bridget, in her summary, summarized, I picked about the importance of meaningful engagement and what that entails in terms of, who initiates it, for what purpose, who participates, and how they participate. And that on their own, those parameters on their own provide ethical, questions in terms of the how those ought to be done. The ethical composition of, who gets involved, the boundaries, the scope, and how people, should participate came out from Bridget's, presentation as key ethical, aspects that need to be looked at, in looking at the amplification of marginalized, voices. Then we came to the first presentation, which looked at decentralized priorities for central schemes, and by Jaya. And he presented a case study on how they applied the GLA approach, a modified GLA approach to set national level health priorities. He talked about the model of the model rural health research unit scheme, which involved a total of 30 schemes spread across India, and the aim was to provide a platform for research for the community with the aim of improving health in rural areas. Now, before I talk about what ethical issues Jaya presented, I would like to invite two participants to now tell us what are the key ethical issues that you could pick from that presentation. Volunteers? Okay, we'll go there.
One of the issues for me was thinking in reciprocity when we are doing these kind of exercises. I don't know if everybody agrees, but that was my feeling.
All right. The second ethical issue that you could pick from. I need my phone to time myself.
I'm only, unless someone else wants to.
There was another issue, I think, that was raised by Jaya, is the amount of disparities in the voices that he had during the conversation between the people with lived experiences and the experts. And he and the team has to do a lot of moderation to meet them somewhere in the midline. So that was a difficult task, as he said, that it is not very easy always, because there are quite divergent views and opinions and needs, felt needs between the experts and the people with lived experiences.
All right, one more. Then I start, okay, Mike?
I got the microphone.
Go ahead.
I think a question for me, which I think is an ethical one, but wasn't made explicit there, but I think it is important, is how we think about the relationship between the examples that we heard presented and discussed and the kinds of issues that Joe presented in his keynote talk. So how do we think locally, institutionally, or specific health area, like family planning or whatever it might be, and these bigger global questions about resource prioritization? Because we've got a tendency, of course, because we're focused on context and the importance of that in this kind of meeting, we've got a tendency to focus on the local, of course, because that's really interesting. But how we draw the relationship between that and the kind of things that Joe was suggesting we should be trying to achieve globally, I think is a really important set of questions which we maybe don't have time for now, but work needs to be done on that connection.
Absolutely. And I want to give you some hints. One of the things that was flagged in that presentation is the issue about governance. And I want to know whether you are able to pick any ethical issue around governance. I've given you a hint, so it should be easy then. What are the ethical issues around governance? Who wants to go? Yes? I see a hand there. All right. There's a... Yes, behind you. If you raise your hand, please make sure it's up enough so I can see.
No, I just wasn't sure when somebody else wanted to talk, so if not, I could go for it. Governance can mean a lot of things: governance of part setting, governance of the organization that hosts part setting, but assuming it's the governance of the part setting, I think some of the things that came up a lot is the conflict of interest and how people try to exclude certain topics because of other political issues and the level of transparency around it and whether it was acceptable or not. And this was also a huge discussion in the group we had around how corruption sometimes kind of comes into it and causes issue. Sometimes it's defendable because of political issues, sometimes becomes a problematic issue. I don't know whether that was what you're hinting for, but...
Okay. Another issue? All right. One of the issues that struck me in this presentation, especially within the context of governance, is the issue about, representation, especially when you look at such a huge context, such as India, and when you think about the diversity and how to reconcile the different divergent views that come, with priority setting, but also most importantly, I think what was flagged by the presenter regards to, issues about, language barrier, but also, the priority of priority setting itself, the huge resources that go into priority setting and what that means in terms of already a context where the resources are constrained, and whether you want to devote resources to more kind of, tangible, problems, or whether you want to devote a huge amount of resources into priority setting. And I think that's not a question that, I am able to even articulate and try to resolve in my mind, but it's an issue that all of us should also, think about and try to reflect how to deal with this. Then there was the issue about decolonization. I don't know if you can remember what ethical issues were raised around decolonization. Yes?
Yeah, in Jay's presentation, he said something like he excluded institutes that were overrepresented initially, and they had their major voice. So for this particular program, which is targeted for the rural population, they're mainly the other stakeholders as experts were included, but not the premier institutes, which are kind of deliberately excluded from this exercise.
All right.
Yeah, I just want to add on to that, So I shared about that on social media, and it's getting a lot of traction because for those of us who come from India and maybe many other contexts, all of us have had experiences where certain institutions in our countries drive health research. They are the ones who always get the grants. They are the ones who are all on all the funding committees. They are the ones who make the decisions. And that precludes young researchers from other parts of the country, especially coming from relatively more impoverished or marginalized sections of the country, having an opportunity to contribute to research. So I think that is that's also a form of corruption. Whether we call it an ethics issue or not, we have to acknowledge that corruption is a major ethics issue in our countries, and that needs to be talked about openly.
Yeah, and I think that cuts across many settings. The kind of feeling of entitlement when you have been in the game for so long, it kind of brings power disparities and influences that are sometimes so subtle you can't even realize them. All right, so we then talk about setting the boundaries. The presenter talked about the issue of setting the boundaries, especially in terms of defining the scope, where there are so many things and so many factors at play. And then there was the issue about diverse priorities, especially when you're looking at it from a national level vis-a-vis, regional, priorities. And I think the conclusion was very, for me, it was very touchy, but also it was something that I went away thinking about, okay, so which way? Because the conclusion was priority setting at a national level is not easy, it's complex. And when you look at all the dynamics that were presented in the, in this, discussion, especially around the fact that it's a huge population, there are so many things at play, there are so many diverse issues, it's complex, and it brings in the issue about, then so which way do we go? Do we talk about, national priority setting? Do we go down to regional, or which is the best, what is the best, standard? Because many of us will find ourselves in this kind of a situation where we're dealing with a huge population, and we want to talk about priority setting. All right, so we go to the next one, the last, which is the presentation given by Zelalem, and it was about the women's pelvic floor disorders. I think there were so many ethical issues here that were, I just want to hear about a couple of them. Am I good with time? 1 minute, all right.
Thanks. Our group had a really spirited discussion around this, and after I overcame my PTSD of the photo of the prolapsed uterus, which brought me back to a night early in my career when I had to deliver a grand multip who had a complete uterine prolapse after delivering the baby, all by myself with the nurse. So one of the things, I think it picks up from what Florencia was saying, and to a theme that Joe raised in his keynote. So this notion of engaging, people with lived experience and asking them questions about what their priorities are. It's a species of research, but it's not actually framed as research. And so we have a large literature around, what do we owe research participants? But then some people push back in our group, well, they're not really research participants, they're citizens who are informing their health system about needs. So this tension between reciprocity and what Joe called priority setting and priority setting, how do we actually clearly articulate the ground rules for engagement so that we actually have confidence that everybody understands what they're involved in and what the consequences are? And I think it was Toto who raised the point at the end. The very act of going in and asking sets off ripple effects and disturbances in systems. And I don't think we've actually grappled with that sufficiently. So I think that was my key takeaway. And I think it's ethically very important.
Thank you, spot on. I think that was also my point, that there seems to be a gray area there, and it's the same tension that we have when it comes to public health, interventions, and how we ethically, engage, populations around that vis-a-vis, research interventions. And I think that's still a gray area that we need to reflect on and think around how to deal with that, especially when it comes to either compensation or reciprocity, and how to, yesterday in our group we dealt with how those kind of, either you talk about it as, compensation, the ethical implications that then introduce in that, particular, approach as well. Then finally we had the funders panel. One take-home message from the funders panel, because they were cutting across different, areas. Yes.
I'm passionate about this one. One thing that came up that we wanted to get across to the funders is what we see is still this lack of capacity building. So making sure that in the process of providing funding in LMICs that we're building up that human resource capacity and all the other capacities that are needed for eventually LMICs to be able to do the research and take it over themselves. So you're never going to be able, they're never going to be able to drive the ship, so to speak, until they have everything they need to be able to make those decisions independently and drive their ship. So I think that's really lacking, that aspect.
Thank you. All right. There's one at the back, in the middle, and at the front. Okay, so we start with the middle.
Thank you. One home-take message that I feel like from that discussion was, how is it possible to align the priorities of the funders and the national, whatever, the local priorities? Yeah.
I think that also came up in our discussion, in the group discussion, how funders come up with their priorities, but they want to now drive them at the national level, where the national level, there are also national priorities, and how to align those together becomes a challenge. Yes?
I think very much linked to that point as well, which we had discussed in our group, was around the powers at play that influence the funders' agenda. And so how their priorities are really set, but also talking about advocacy groups and those who really shout the loudest have a very big impact on the funding agenda and the global health agenda, which links directly back to marginalized groups and people without a voice, and how to really get them to have more of an impact on these bigger funding agendas. So that's really about linking the global with the national and the local, but also taking into account these bigger powers at play and other various organizations that we know also impact the funding agenda.
Absolutely, and I think that also came up as a kind of a surprise to me, that there are all manner of, politics and power plays that play out at the funder level. So I wasn't aware about that, but again, that came up as quite an interesting and complex issue. There was a hand here. Yes, please. Oh, okay. Go ahead.
I think one of the observation that came out was that the funders are talking very well with each other, but there's a gap. It's a one-way flow. Money is given, but is there a flow backwards in terms to information to the funders on how best they can improve, the systems and the processes that they're using? That didn't quite come out very clearly.
Absolutely.
And just an observation from our group that it seemed that the funders were overwhelmingly oriented to funding biomedical interventions. And despite all of our discussion around equity and social determinants, I didn't hear a clear commitment to funding research in social determinants and upstream causes. So very much a downstream disease focus, the belief that drugs, diagnostics, and vaccines are going to alleviate the major causes of illness and in the world. So really push the funders, with my public health cap on, to actually fund meaningful community interventions that might improve population health that isn't molecular based. Over.
Thank you. The last one there's one last one, and then we.
Thank you very much. I just needed to say this because I think it came out very interestingly in my group, where we were told that Canada has moved from calling the marginalized so and is calling them the equity deserving. Initially, they called them the equity demanding, and they changed that to the equity deserving. And I thought it was a really poignant way of thinking about this group. And it gives action to the need to really bridge the gap. When we call them marginalized, we're just labeling them. Mm-hmm. But it's more actionable if we call them equity deserving. Thank you.
Yeah, I think what really struck me during the funders' presentation, and I take this, totally from the context of low and middle country, is how to bridge the gap between over-dependence on funders, especially within the context of governments in low and middle-income countries, where especially for early career researchers, you feel very vulnerable when your government doesn't give nothing. You always depend on looking out for support, and that on its own can really make you feel very vulnerable and voiceless, even though you are, in a context where you think you can contribute something. But the fact that your government isn't supporting the, endeavor that you are promoting can put you in a very, in a very tricky position. And I think I couldn't quite, get the link between what the funders are doing and how they are kind of holding the governments that do not still quite, they don't quite see the value in promoting research in their national boundaries, to get them up to speed with at least putting something on the table, so that when especially early career researchers and of course researchers from low and middle income countries sit on the decision making table, they feel truly part and parcel of that process. Thank you.